Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now, we're back here on the Bible study couch for another Bible study, and last week I was trying to do a Bible study on the Table of Nations, looking at Genesis 10 and where the sons of Noah spread throughout the globe. And I had originally intended to make this a single Bible study, but as I just went through the sons of Japheth, it went kind of much longer than I thought it was going to take, and so I've decided to break this up into 3 parts instead. So we just finished up last week looking at the descendants of Japheth and where they spread out across the globe, and today we're going to pick up with the descendants of Ham and the Hamitic peoples. So the next son mentioned in Genesis 10 is Ham, although as I mentioned in Genesis 9:24, it says that Ham is actually the youngest son of Noah. So, Ham's people spread throughout the continent of Africa and also into some parts of Arabia. Now, the Hamitic peoples were the darker-skinned people. And it is possible also that your Australian Aboriginals and also the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea are related to the Africans and are thus Hamitic peoples. This is based largely on genetics and skin tone, that it is believed that the Australian Aboriginals, their closest relatives would be the African tribes, that they're not closely related to like the Maoris of New Zealand, which are Polynesian people. They're not closely related to your Southeast Asians, and that the Aboriginals seem to be much closer connected to the Africans. Now, how you get people from Africa to Australia and not really have anyone in between is a great mystery. I mean, people have moved around throughout history. I mean, you know, I'm a European by descent, a Caucasian, an Ashkenaz, as we mentioned in the previous study. I'm white, I'm a Japhethic person. You know, the Japhethic people kind of originally lived along the Mediterranean, up around the Caspian and the Black Seas, the Caucasus regions. They spread into Europe, and then, you know, they spread further into the Americas and to the Australias. You know, you had the Magogites spread into East Asia, and then from there into the Americas and into the Pacific Islands. I mean, New Zealand itself was originally settled by like Polynesian peoples around the 1200s. So people have moved around. I mean, you have during the Islamic conquest, you had Arabian people moving to Indonesia, you know, just north of Australia. So it's very possible that somewhere, somehow throughout history, people moved and some people from Africa ended up in Australia. And the fact that there were probably nobody else here before they got here, it's quite easy that they just basically settled the land. I mean, even evolutionary scientists believe the Australian Aboriginals came from Africa somehow. Basically a lot of island hopping from Africa across Asia into Southeast Asia, down to Papua New Guinea, and then across into Australia. They say that happened like anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 years ago. As a young Earth creationist, I believe that the world is only about 6,000 to 7,000 years old, depending on whether you use the Masoretic text or the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, and that Noah's flood happened in about, I'm blanking on the dates, but probably about 4,000 years ago. I mean, like Abraham lived in the 2000s, so that's 4,000 years ago. So probably about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago the flood happened. So it's only really post then that people spread out. So in my argument, I would say that the Aboriginals haven't been here for 40,000 years. They've been here for probably 4,000 years. And so that's, as a creationist, young Earth creationist, I would say that they've only been here for about 4,000 years. And I do know that there are some people, particularly in your creation scientists, they've talked to the Aboriginals and gone through the Australian Aboriginal traditions, and they'll talk about their dream time, and the fact that when the Aboriginals talk about like their ancestors, that they don't seem to have thousands and thousands of generations. It's more like hundreds of generations, which would only go back a couple thousand years. That just based on the Aboriginal word of mouth traditions, that they themselves don't think they've been here for more than thousands of years, or at least the traditional Aboriginal stories. I mean, now with the inclusion of evolutionary science and the arguments that, oh, we use carbon dating to say this Aboriginal skeleton has been here for 100,000 years, you know, more modern Aboriginal people of Australia will argue that they've been here for like hundreds of thousands of years or something like that, or at least tens of thousands of years. But there are the ones that have, if you go through their traditional stories, it seems to imply thousands of years rather than hundreds of thousands of years. And if you're a young Earth creationist like myself, you think that like Noah's flood happened about like 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and so they could only have been here for like the last 4,000 years plus, a little bit over 4,000 years. And how they got here, I mean, there's the whole spreading out from the Tower of Babel. As one thing we're going to get to, because Nimrod, the guy who basically, according to Josephus, founded the town of Babylon and the Tower of Babel, he himself was a Hamitic person. He was a son of Cush, and Cush is the ancestor of the Ethiopians. So Nimrod himself would have been of kind of that Ethiopian ethnicity, and so he is not in Africa, he's around Babylon, so that's up there near Iraq, and so it's very possible that some of his descendants spread eastward into Asia. I mean, also when you get into places like India, while a lot of Indians, when people think of India, they think of your Hindi people, the more brown skin, middle brown tone of skin people. But that's not the only people that live in that region. There are people there are people in that area that have darker skin, and it's very possible that they could be Hamitic, or like a Hamitic-Semitic mix. Like maybe they were descended from Ham, but they intermarried with the Semitic people there as well. And so it's not like there's no darker skinned people between Africa and Australia. There are some in between, like in India and Southeast Asia. So it is very likely that, you know, people got kind of moved from place to place to place, so they end up in Australia. Now, that's kind of a very side tangent, and it's probably best we just get on with the study, but it's really just addressing the question that it is believed that the Australian Aboriginals came from Africa. And that's not just creationists saying that, even evolutionists say that as well. And as a creationist who believes the Bible, I would argue that they're both Hamitic type people, which is what we're going to get to in our study now. So, the Cushites are the first. Well, Cush is the oldest son of Ham, and so the Cushites come from Cush. Cush is one of the easiest places to locate. So in the study on Japheth, there was a lot of, maybe they were here, Luther said this, Josephus said this, others have said this. There's a lot of theories as to where people went. Cush is not one of them, because we know where Cush was, because Cush became like this big kingdom. The kingdom of Ethiopia was originally like the kingdom of Cush. So we know where Cush was. So it's not a great mystery. That's one we can like nail down as, okay, we know exactly where Cush went. See, Cush is Ethiopia, pretty much anywhere south of Egypt. Cush is also credited with being the ancestor of the Nubians and also possibly the Sudanese as well. It's most likely that Cush and his descendants would have spread out into Central and South Africa, and also possibly even to West Africa. I mean, if Cush went kind of south of Egypt and inhabited, there's no colonies because these are the first peoples, so they were the original inhabitants of Ethiopia. Well, people had to get to South and Central and West Africa from somewhere. And it's very likely that they spread from Ethiopia down. And so Cush is probably also the ancestor of all the natives in Central and South Africa as well. Although one of Cush's son is Nimrod, and as we'll mention, he moved northeast into the land of Shinar and Babylon, so up around modern-day Iraq, that area. And so it is possible that it's from Nimrod's descendants that they moved eastward, and this could explain how the Hamitic peoples ended up in places like Australia and Papua New Guinea. But let's look at the specifics of the sons of Cush, because Cush is, again, one of these guys that get mentioned as sons. Now, the fact is, a lot of these people would have had children that aren't named. It's possible that even Cush had more sons. Like, I went in, like, the previous one, like, oh, Gomer had 7 sons. Could have had 20 sons for all I know. It's only specific sons that are named. And some of his sons, their sons are mentioned, and other ones aren't. So, like, sometimes we know about, Cush's grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And not all of them are named. The only ones that are named are important figures, which means that it's most likely that they're the ones that established nations. So if they actually get mentioned in the list, it means that they were influential in establishing a nation. And so from Cush, we get Seba. Now, Seba is the eldest son of Cush, and he's connected with the Sabians in southern Arabia, located in modern-day Yemen, which is kind of, if you put Cush in Ethiopia, you kind of jump across the Red Sea, you're into Yemen. Not exactly, but that's kind of how I mean, you got the Horn of Africa where Ethiopia is, and you jump across into Arabia, and then you're in Yemen. So, Seba probably jumped across, so he's near his father, but also separated from his father. And he's probably the ancestor of the Yemenis and, like, the natives of Yemen and southern Arabia. I know Luther and them talked about this idea that Cush and them were located in Arabia, but we know that Cush is located in Ethiopia. So that's something that we can nail down. The next is an interesting figure, is Havilah. And the main reason he's an interesting figure is that there are more than one Havilah. There's a Hamitic Havilah, but there's also a Semitic Havilah, who is the son of Joktan, the son of Heber, from the Hebrews. This makes confusion, because there's names like Havilah and Sheba and that pop up multiple times. Yet there do seem to be multiple people. Like, we'll talk about the Queen of Sheba, and it's most likely she's from Ethiopia. Although some people have placed her in like modern day Yemen. But there is also a Sheba later that is descended from the Midianites. I think he's descended from the Midianites. There's a Sheba who is descended from Abraham and his essentially third wife, Keturah. And so there are multiple people using the same names floating around. And so this does make it confusing when you want to go, oh, who lived where, when you have people with multiple names. And so there seems to be a Hamitic Havilah and a Semitic Havilah. And this is important when we get into the discussions about Havilah and the land of India. See, Luther in his commentary states that Cush is connected with the Negro race, and thus the Hamitic Havilah is not the ancestor of the Indians. As you'll find that Josephus and that connects Havilah with India. But obviously these are two different Havilahs. Josephus himself connected this Havilah being the ancestor of the Berbers and kind of the natives of northwest Africa and the Sahara Desert. That's where kind of Josephus placed this Havilah. So he's kind of over in that Western Africa area, in the area of the Sahara. Josephus then also connects the Semitic Havilah, who we'll talk about next week, with India, declaring that the river Pishon, mentioned in Genesis 2:11, which flowed through the land of Havilah, being connected with the Ganges River in India. So there are two different Havilahs. The Havilah here we're talking about is most likely the ancestor of the Berbers and all your West African people. Next is Sabta, and Josephus connected Sabta with the Astaborans. These are the ancestors of the Sudanese. So as I said before, Cush is kind of attributed being the ancestor of the Ethiopians and the Sudanese. Directly the Sudanese kind of from his third son, Sabta. The next son of Cush is Ramah. Ramah also gets his sons mentioned, Sheba and Dedan. These are possibly just other lands around Ethiopia. For example, Sheba here is mentioned as one of the sons of Ramah. And the fact that he gets mentioned means that he probably established like a little kingdom or a city-state or a tribal area or something. He established some kind of small nation separate from the nation of Cush. But then you get the Queen of Sheba. And she's most likely from Ethiopia. And this is an important thing because Luther connected Ramah and his sons Sheba and Dedan with the Arabians. And so have many scholars, including Josephus, connected these guys with southern Arabia. And yet Josephus, who connects Sheba with southern Arabia, Josephus, when he talks about the Queen of Sheba, said that she came from Ethiopia. Luther calls her the Queen of the South. Now, both Arabia and Ethiopia are kind of south of Israel, so that could really be anywhere. But Josephus does refer to the Queen of Sheba as the Queen of Ethiopia, not the Queen of, like, Arabia. So, it is possible that there are two different Shebas. And we know there are two different Shebas because there is a Sheba descended from Abraham and Keturah. And so it's most likely that Sheba is the one in Saudi Arabia, and this other Sheba is the one connected with Ethiopia, from which the Queen of Sheba actually comes. Because she's a Canaanite woman. Not Canaanite, a Cushite woman. Mixing up the descendants of Ham here. The next person that is mentioned is Sabtaka, and he was connected with the Nubians in southern Egypt, kind of a little bit north of Cush. Kind of if you went like Egypt, Nubia, Cush, kind of in your ancient kingdoms. And then the final son of Cush is Nimrod. And he is known to be the first of the mighty warriors post the flood. He's like the first king. Like literally, he's the first kingdom. Now, you probably have people setting up city-states and establishing like small kingdoms. Like a city-state and having a king or a tribal chief. Nimrod is credited in the book of Genesis as being like the first king. He's the first person to establish a kingdom. Not just a city-state, but like rule over a whole area, over multiple cities. He's like the first king in the Bible. And Nimrod, he lived in the land of Shinar. He established the town of Babel, also known as Babylon. It is the same word in Hebrew, and is credited in Josephus as the guy who initiated the building of the Tower of Babel. Now, based on the fact that in Genesis 10 here, Nimrod is said to have founded Babylon and lived in the land of Shinar, yet when we get to the days of Abraham, later in the book of Genesis, it's the Chaldeans that ruled over this land, and the Chaldeans are those descended from Arphaxad, the ancestor of Abraham. It is most likely that following the Tower of Babel incident, that Nimrod lost control of this land and it later ended up in the hands of the Chaldeans. And yeah, so kind of that's what happened to Nimrod. Now it's possible that Nimrod could have spread anywhere, being the most eastward descendant of Cush and the only one outside, not just that, kind of the most eastward descendant of Ham, and apart from the Canaanites being the one that's like most outside of Africa, it's very possible that if any of the Hamites went and spread to places like Australia and that they probably came from Nimrod, since he was the most eastward and he possibly spread further east. At least his children went that way. So possibly the Australian Aboriginals and that are Hamitic peoples via Cush, via Nimrod. And that is possible. I mean, you know, if you talk to your evolutionary scientists, they'll say genetically speaking, your Ethiopians and your Australian Aboriginals, like, that's the closest pairing that you're going to find. Like, the closest people outside of Australia that are genetically connected to the Australian Aboriginals are like your native Ethiopians. So it's possible that the Australian Aboriginals are Cushites, possibly descended from Nimrod. Possibly. I don't know. I wasn't there, and that's like 4,000 years of history. Who knows? And who knows when people landed where? God knows, and we'll leave it to him. But this is fun. This is part of the study. There's a lot of speculation here. The next son of Ham is Mizraim. And this is Egypt. Mizraim is just the Hebrew name or the Hebrew word for Egypt. So we're talking about the land of Egypt. Now we have Ludim, and he's connected with the North African around Egypt. Some have connected him with the Lydians up in Eastern Anatolia. Sorry, I think Western Anatolia. I said Eastern, but I mean Western Anatolia. If so, it is possible that the Lydians or the Ludim have mixed in with the Javan peoples of Greece and Anatolia. Although, as we'll get to next week when we talk about Lud, the descendant of Shem, he is also attributed with being the ancestor of the Lydians. So, take your pick. It's more likely that probably Ludim here, the descendant of the Egyptians, probably stayed around Egypt rather than heading up into Anatolia and Greece. It's more likely that that might be from the Semitic people. Next we have Anamim. He's connected with the area of Cyrene and in Libya. Next we have Lahabim, and Josephus just says he is the ancestor of the Libyans. Then you also have Naphtuhim. He is actually connected with the peoples of Memphis in lower or northern Egypt. And then you have Pathusim. I'm not going to pronounce that name right. Pathusim. I'm going to say that. I'm going to leave it at that. He's connected with the people of Pathros in upper or southern Egypt. And so it is believed that Naphtuhim and Pathusim are the representatives, they're the ancestors of the upper kingdom of Egypt, and the lower kingdom of Egypt would eventually merge to form the old kingdom of Egypt. For those who know their Egyptian history, there was a kingdom in the north or lower Egypt and a kingdom in the south or upper Egypt, and they eventually merged to form what we now know as the old kingdom of Egypt. And it's possibly from these two sons of Mizraim. Probably not exactly these two sons, but the descendants of these two sons. Next we have Coelc-atc. Now he is actually said in Genesis 10 to have been the ancestor of the Philistines. And he has been located around the west of the Nile Delta region. But what is interesting is we get to the next and final son on Mizraim, Cathtorim. And Cathtorim is also connected with the Philistines in the books of Jeremiah and the books of Amos. In Jeremiah 47 verse 4 and Amos 9:7, the Philistines are connected with Cathtor. I'm going to get this name right. Cathtorim. In Amos, he actually, in Amos 9:7, he calls the Philistines from Cathtor. So this suggests that Caelclusim and Caphtor may have merged together to be the ancestors of the Philistines. Now, Caphtor is connected with the island of Crete and the original inhabitants of the island of Crete, so possibly the Minoans, or even people before the Minoans. And this is interesting because the people of Crete were later kind of colonized and taken over by the early Greeks. So this could explain the theory about the Philistines being the dreaded sea peoples who may have sparked the Bronze Age collapse. So for those who don't know, the Bronze Age collapse is basically, you had these really powerful kingdoms like the Hittites, the Egyptians, and they were really big and powerful. And then there's just this event called the Bronze Age collapse around the 1100s, around the time of the period of the Judges, actually, where basically all these big kingdoms and empires just collapsed. And scholars today still debate what caused this, things from famine, war, etc. One of the popular theories is the dreaded sea people, because the Egyptians write about these people called the sea peoples, who came from the sea, and they basically settled down in this area, and they caused trouble. And many people, many scholars have connected the Philistines, the sea peoples, with the Philistines. And so the Philistines came from the sea and then kind of landed in what later became Philistia, and from there kind of went on to cause this Bronze Age collapse. This is one of the theories. But then, where did the Philistines come from? Well, if, you know, Amos connects the Philistines with Kaftor, and Moses in Genesis also connects them with the Calusims. If they were on the island of Crete, and then they got pushed out by the Greeks, so kind of you got this really cascading effect where like the Dorians invaded from like Macedonia area into Greece, and that kind of pushed those Greeks down into like the places like Crete, and that pushed the original Cretans, or whoever they were called before that, off that island. If the Philistines were these original Cretans, you know, that could explain like getting pushed down. Like the Dorians invade Greece, the Greeks invade Crete, the Cretes then get pushed off, and they come and settle in Philistia and form the Philistines. So that's one possible theory. This would explain kind of where the Philistines came from. They do just seem to pop up in the Old Testament. They weren't there, and then they kind of just are there. And like I said, there's this idea that they are the dreaded sea people. There is a theory that that's where the Philistines come from the sea, but from where, we don't know. Possibly from Crete. Theories. The next son is Put. And locating Put is a very difficult task because nobody really knows where Put comes from. Josephus doesn't even mention Put in his History of the Jews. So there's another one of those cases where Josephus just doesn't mention him. And so because of this, Luther in his Genesis commentary says that nothing definitive is known about Put, and he possibly just perished. Luther does mention that even though nothing is definitively known, many exegetes of his day connected Put with Libya, Numidia, and Mauritania and Cyrene. Thus, Luther himself held that Put kind of perished, but it is possible that Put is the original ancestor of kind of the North Africans. The people that spread across all the way from Libya to Mauritania to kind of modern-day Morocco. The people who were later colonized by the Phoenicians. So for those who don't know as well, the Phoenicians, which are descended from the Sidonians over in Tyre and Sidon, they became quite powerful, and they went and colonized the Mediterranean, and one of their colonies in North Africa was the colony of Carthage, which then later went on to become the Carthaginian Empire, or Carthaginian Kingdom, which then had wars with the Roman Republic, and that's the Punic Wars, and there's a whole big history there. But, so it's possible that if, like Luther says that Put got wiped out, and that some exegetes have connected Put with that kind of North African coastland, this could fit with Luther's theory that Put got wiped out, that maybe Put, he originally established the lands across North Africa, but then later when the Phoenicians came and colonized along the Mediterranean, that they wiped out the original Putites, or whatever they were called. Although, since the Putites, since the Phoenicians were Sidonians, and the Sidonians were Canaanites, and both the Canaanites and the Putites were Hamitic peoples, it is also possible that maybe they just assimilated together. Like, it doesn't have to be that the Phoenicians completely wiped out the Putites. I mean, if they're both Hamitic peoples, they're probably very similar in culture and religion and ethnicity, and it's very possible they could have just blended together. That's a possibility as well. Put is an interesting place because he can't have been wiped out too early, because Put does get mentioned in the prophets of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. For example, Jeremiah 46:9 mentions Put being alongside Cush and Lud. Now this could be the Semitic Lud, one of the sons of Shem, or it could be referring to the Hermetic Ludim, as we mentioned just above. Ezekiel 30 verse 5 also mentions Put in relation with the lands of Cush and Lud, but he also does mention them alongside Arabia and the land of Chub. which is possibly Libya, although it could be Arabia. Then there's also Ezekiel 38:5, which places Put alongside Cush, but also puts Put alongside Persia, Gomer, and Togarmah. Now, some would suggest that Put must be near Lud and Cush. But we know that Persia, Gomer, and Togarmah were much further away from Cush. And so it's possible that the prophets aren't talking about like literal locations and more broad regions, or like they say, you know, Cush and Put and Persia and Gomer, and maybe that's a kind of south and north way of speaking. We don't really know where Put is. John Safati himself has said that some scholars have tried to connect Put with the Putyata, which is in modern-day Somalia, which would then also put Put closer to the land of Cush. And so that may match the scriptural references in Jeremiah and Ezekiel of placing Put near Cush. And so maybe Put is the ancestor of the Somalians and that area. Lastly, we end up with the final son of Ham, which is Canaan. And again, Canaan is one that we know where he is, because it's the land of Canaan. It's the land that the Israelites essentially took over and inhabited and established the land of Israel and Judah, later Judea. So we know where Canaan was. And the sons of Canaan are just the different tribes of Canaan. Many of them aren't very important. We don't really know exactly where they want. Some of the most notable ones would be the oldest son of Canaan, Sidon, from where we get the Sidonians, the Tyrians, and also the Phoenicians. The second son of Canaan is Heth, from where we get the Hittites. Now this is interesting because at the time of Genesis 10, the Hittites seem to be located just in North Canaan. But by the time we get to the days of Joseph, the patriarch, all the way through to Samuel, the prophet, so this really covers the period from like the 1600s to the 1200s, the Hittites really spread out and took over the whole land of Anatolia. So as I mentioned in last week's study, you had some of the sons of Japheth originally lived in Anatolia, and it kind of seems that they got wiped out or conquered or assimilated into the Hittite Empire, which really spread out and took over Anatolia. And then the Jebusites are the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, just on the Hittites, because this is very interesting, because you sometimes hear people talk about like, oh, we need to give land back to its original inhabitants. To which you go, to who then? Like, if we really got to go back to where we came from and give land back to the original inhabitants, well then who do you give the land back to? Like, you look at somewhere like the land of Turkey. So, before the nation of Turkey, there was the Ottoman Empire and other empires and stuff like that. And before that, it was part of like the Byzantine Empire. And before that, it was part of the Roman Empire. And so, if you go Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, this is Arabian peoples. And they're most likely descended from Ishmael and Esau and these descendants of Abraham. So they're Semitic peoples. But before them, it was ruled over by the Byzantines. And these were Greeks. And so they're Japhethic peoples. And before them, it was ruled, well, the Romans, there was the Greeks still. The Greeks had it, the Trojans, all these people. But before them, it was ruled by the Hittites, which were Hermetic people. But then even before the Hittite Empire, you had the Proto-Hittites, or the people before the Hittites, were most likely your Japhethic people as well. So really, if you're gonna go by that logic, the first people to originally inhabit Anatolia were Japhethic peoples, your Caucasians. And so if you really want to go based on that logic of giving it back to its original inhabitants, then maybe Anatolia needs to be given to like the Armenians, because that's the thing, that's probably like you can say Japhethic people, but even Japhethic people can be divided into groups, because the Greeks were Javan people, whereas the original inhabitants of Anatolia before the Hittite Empire were most likely your Caucasian, your South Caucasian people, the people today that would be like your Georgians, your Armenians and stuff like that. So in reality, if you're going to go back to the original inhabitants, Anatolia has kind of shifted hands a lot. It's kind of, the original inhabitants would be the people that are kind of your modern-day Armenians. And then after them came your Hittites, so this is more your Canaanite, Hamitic peoples. And so people that are kind of, their closest relatives would be like your Ethiopians. So do you give the land to Ethiopia? But then after them, it got taken over by the Greeks. And so do you give it to the Greeks? But then after the Greeks, you kind of had Europeans from like the Goths and Germanic peoples took it. But then after them, it got taken over by the Arabian peoples and became like the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey. So I mean, it's currently belongs to Arabic peoples. But before the Arabics, there were Gothic Germanic peoples. Before them, there were Greek peoples. Before them, there was like your Sidonian, Hittite, Hamitic peoples. And before them, it was kind of your Armenian, South Caucasian peoples. So if you really want to go giving land back to their original inhabitants, there's going to be a lot of land swapping around, and a lot of land has to be given back to a lot of people. Particularly, like, many people have moved ever since, like, throughout history, people just move all the time. Like, Europeans now live in the Americans and Australia. Before that, they were kind of isolated to Europe. But then, you know, North Africa. Well, the original inhabitants of North Africa were like your Berbers and your original ancient Egyptians, and they kind of got wiped out and taken over by your Arabians during the Islamic conquests. So the original inhabitants of like North Africa are not the people who live there now. Your modern day Egyptians are not the same as your ancient Egyptians. But then, you know, same with, like, you know, Alexander the Great's empire, the Roman Empire. Empires and colonies and all this stuff, it happens throughout history, and people move constantly. So where people originated is kind of redundant because people move all the time. And there's also intermarrying and mixing and assimilation and colonization and wars and famines, and like even that, famines and wars, like people moved around. Like you have the Israelites, who Abraham himself is a Chaldean by birth. Abraham originally was born in Babylon of the like around of the Chaldeans, around the area of Babylon in modern day Iraq. That's where Abraham was from, and yet, you know, he moved to the land of Aram, and then he moved into the land of Canaan, and then for a period of time he was down in the land of Egypt, and then also his descendants who were in Canaan, they later moved down to the land of Egypt, and then they later went back up to Israel. And then you also have other descendants of Abraham, like the Midianites and the Edomites and the Ishmaelites, that kind of went from Canaan and spread into Arabia. I mean, just that, the land of Arabia, like we can kind of gather from Josephus, the original inhabitants of Arabia, like what we today would call Saudi Arabia and Yemen, that kind of south area of the Arabian Peninsula, the original inhabitants of that were Cushites, Hamitic peoples, and they later got wiped out by the Ishmaelites and the Edomites and the Midianites, your Semitic people, your Abrahamic peoples. They kind of spread into Arabia and wiped out the original Hamitic peoples that were there. So people move around all the time. And yeah, it's kind of just a side rant about people moving and immigrating, and the fact that you can't really send people back to where they originally came from. Because, I mean, if we want to be logical, if we all go back to where originally I came from, we all got to move to Mount Ararat in modern-day Armenia. And if you try to stick, like, 7 billion people in Mount Ararat, we're not all going to fit. So I think we should just follow the command of God to go forth, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and also the command of Jesus to the apostles to go to the ends of the earth to spread the gospel. That we should move. And that, again, that race doesn't mean anything in the Bible. The Bible doesn't care whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. It cares whether you're a believer or an unbeliever. And so we should be spreading out. We should be intermarrying and spreading throughout the globe. And the Bible doesn't have a problem with different races. Every nation, every tribe, every tongue is welcomed into the people of God, into the church. And so it doesn't matter whether you're Japhethic, Hamitic, or Semitic. As long as you believe in the gospel, that's what's important. And God tells us to go and spread and fill the globe. And he told his disciples to go throughout the empire. And they did. They went throughout the Roman Empire. They went beyond the Roman Empire. They spread throughout the world. You had St. Thomas going to India, St. Matthew going down to Ethiopia, St. Paul heading off to Rome, some of the other apostles heading up into the Germanic regions. And that was God's plan, that we should take the word of God and spread it throughout the globe. And that's the plan. We should be spreading and growing and connecting throughout the globe. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean we have to go like nationalism versus globalism, but I think the fact that there should be kind of, world peace, and that we should aim for a society in which we can spread throughout the world and just everyone get along and everyone believe the gospel, because that's the ultimate mission, is to take the gospel to the ends of the world. And I know these videos are really talking about race and ethnicity and stuff like that, and I want to stress that that's not important. But this is just because we're talking about the Table of Nations and where people spread out from Noah's Ark, and where the sons of Noah and the grandsons of Noah originally settled post the Tower of Babel. Because before the Tower of Babel, people didn't really spread out. That's the whole point of the story of the Tower of Babel, that everybody kind of clumped together. And sure, you would have little groups going here and there, but most people clumped together around Babel and they weren't spreading out. And it's in the days of Peleg, one of the descendants of Shem, where it says it's in his days that the world got divided. That's why his name is Peleg, meaning division. Some people suggest that maybe he was born around the Great Splitting, so just like soon after the Tower of Babel incident that Peleg was born, and so he was named Division, because it was in the age of division where people spread out from Babel and finally went and spread out. And so the point of this study is to look at where people first settled after spreading out from the Tower of Babel. And so just to give a summary of the descendants of Ham, Ham generally spread into the north of Africa, mostly around Egypt and the Nile area, but from there he also went into areas like Arabia and as far to the west as Sahara, and eventually from there he would spread into the rest of Africa, into Central Africa and South Africa, and at some point, somehow, some of the Hamitic peoples also spread to places like Papua New Guinea and Australia. And that kind of wraps up the descendants of Ham, and this is part 2 of our study on the Table of Nations. Join me again next week when we wrap up this series in our study of the Semitic people and the descendants of Shem. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.